Long before the Mississippi Territory was officially carved into the maps of a new America, settlers along the Natchez Trace whispered of a place too quiet to be real. 3 identical children, born in a clearing with no known mother, lived under the watch of a frontier priest whose letters grew increasingly erratic before vanishing altogether. The triplets never spoke, not once. And when neighboring farmers began to report strange silences in their fields, missing livestock or worse, they always traced the trouble back to the house where the triplets stayed. This is not a tale of demons or curses. This is the story of a cover-up so old it predates the nation itself, and of children used by faith as a tool for fear. Father Simeon Blackthorne was no ordinary preacher. Sent by the Diocese of Baltimore before formal statehood reached the Mississippi Territory, his mission was to tame the wild frontier, not just through faith, but through control. At the farthest edge of civilization, where no proper church existed, he established St. Amos of the River's Mercy, a wooden mission, half chapel and half asylum, catering to wandering settlers, ill orphans, and abandoned boys. To the church, his work was seen as salvation in the rawest form, bringing doctrine and order to a land of chaos. He kept strict logs, sent regular correspondence to ecclesiastical authorities, and wrote often of a miracle 3 boys discovered in the woods, never aging, never crying, and never speaking. His words were full of awe, but buried beneath the Latin was the quiet dread of a man unraveling. Because by 1790, the mission was gone. Burned, razed and erased, all that remained were the scorched foundations and the fragments of his final letter, a warning sent too late. The institution's reputation, what stood in the humid, vine-choked clearing, was never meant to last. The St. Amos mission had been assembled from green pine, felled and fastened by Father Blackthorne himself, with the help of 3 indentured Choctaw laborers who spoke no English but followed the priests. Gestures in silence. According to church records, the mission was established on October 17, 1781, though Blackthorne's personal diary suggests he had been living alone in the area for at least 2 years prior, claiming divine visions and wilderness fasting as his reasons for early arrival. It was said he had volunteered for the most distant assignment possible after a disciplinary sabbatical from his duties in the Maryland region, a euphemism often used by the church for clerical infractions that would not hold up to legal inquiry. To the handful of settlers scattered through the river valleys, trappers, ex-soldiers, and families fleeing debt, Father Blackthorne's arrival was not unwelcome. They saw in him a man of books, a source of instruction and moral clarity. The mission served several roles. Its main room was used for Sunday worship, schooling on alternating days, and basic infirmary care when required. Blackthorne, in his letters, described himself as the father to a scattered flock, one who taught Latin psalms in the morning, delivered tinctures to the sick in the afternoon, and transcribed his visions by candlelight at night. What most did not know was that he also kept a second logbook, written not in Latin or English, but in a cipher of his own invention, small loops and angular marks that scholars would later attempt to decode with limited success. The ciphered book, found buried in a tin box nearly a century later, did not mention the triplets by name, but included dozens of entries marked with the phrase, "the 3." One of the few decipherable passages reads, "They do not breathe like we do. Their silence is not quiet, it vibrates." At first, the church celebrated the early reports. The mission was growing. 6 children had been taken in by 1783, all reportedly abandoned by wagon trains or rescued from accidents on the trail. Blackthorne sent detailed letters to Bishop Carroll, citing names, dates, even the food inventories required to sustain the growing household. It was his letter from February 9th of that year, however, that first mentioned the miracle. He wrote, 3 brothers, identical in form, found nestled in the ash grove behind the chapel. No sign of the mother, no footprints, no cries. Their eyes open, their skin pale, no words, yet no distress. They followed me in one by one. They've not left my side since. This account might have been dismissed had it not been followed by sketches, drawings in ink on vellum, sent with wax-sealed stamps, preserved in church archives in Baltimore to this day. The sketches show 3 boys, roughly 6 years old, dressed in what appear to be linen sacks. Their expressions are blank. One holds a bird skull. Another is staring directly at the viewer. The third is mid-step, as if caught walking toward the artist. The caption below reads, "Fig Eye, the Sons of Silence." Local settlers were not immediately alarmed. Blackthorn's reputation as a devout man insulated him from suspicion. When families brought their sick to the mission and found the triplets standing quietly in the yard, they assumed them to be orphans, shy and mute, perhaps traumatized by frontier violence. Some even claimed the boys brought luck. Cotton crops flourished. A blight that had ravaged nearby herds avoided the grazing lands closest to the mission. For a time, Father Blackthorn's reputation only grew. He began weekly sermons referencing the Trinitarian gift and the purity of silence. He banned mirrors from the mission. No one questioned it, but not everyone accepted the mission's rising sanctity. Among the most vocal skeptics was Elias Creel, a fur trader whose roots cut directly through Blackthorn's territory. He had once been injured near the mission and taken in for a 3-day recovery. In his personal journal, recovered by his great-granddaughter in 1911 and published in a small Mississippi folklore compendium, he wrote, "The boys do not eat. I watched. They sat with bowls before them, but never lifted spoon or hand. They blinked in unison. The preacher grows gaunt, talks to the fireplace as if someone replies." Other accounts began to surface, though most were dismissed by church authorities. Settler children complained of hearing humming outside their cabins at night, low, rhythmic, and perfectly in tune. Animals refused to cross into the mission's clearing. A midwife who visited to deliver supplies claimed she was not allowed past the door and saw one of the boys standing in the rain, unmoving, his palms open and empty, as if waiting for something to fall. Blackthorn's own demeanor began to shift. Letters to Baltimore became less articulate. He spoke in metaphors, referenced shadows that do not match their hosts, and lamented the lack of true silence in the forest anymore. Still, the mission received visitors. Young boys were dropped off by men too poor to feed them, and Blackthorn always accepted them with the same blank smile. None of those boys were ever seen again. Records note their arrival, but not their departure. The church blamed the terrain, the perils of the wilderness, native raids. It was an easy excuse. But one woman, a widow named Agatha Penmore, whose son had been given to the mission in June 1784, returned months later demanding to see him. She was turned away. She reported seeing only the triplets, who stared at her without blinking. She left trembling and reportedly took her own life the following winter. And then, in late autumn of that year, the letters stopped. The church sent riders. The first one never returned. The second reported the mission burned to the ground, with no sign of bodies or struggle. Only the triplets' sleeping mats remained, perfectly laid out, each holding a single polished stone. No ashes, no blood. Just silence. Ignored signs. The smoke had long since faded when the church's second rider, Brother Thaddeus Quinn, reached the ruins of St. Amos. What he found was unnerving, not for what was present, but for what was missing. There were no charred remains, no bones, no signs of animals or scavengers. The logs that once formed the walls were collapsed neatly inward, like a bonfire that had folded into itself with precision. The altar stone remained untouched, and on it lay a bound volume of scripture completely unburned. Thaddeus retrieved only 2 items from the scene: Father Blackthorn's final journal, written in a hand so cramped it appeared almost carved into the page, and a piece of slate etched with childlike symbols. He brought them both back to Baltimore, and, according to diocesan records, was never seen again after delivering them. The church, eager to suppress whispers of heresy or mysticism, released a formal statement blaming hostile elements and fire for the destruction. They gave no explanation for the missing children. Yet within weeks, settlers who had once revered the mission began to tell quieter, more fearful stories. Stories they had kept to themselves during the mission's operation. Stories they hadn't dared to speak aloud until the structure was gone. Elizabeth Carraway, wife of a former militia captain, confessed to her sister in a letter that she had stopped attending sermons after seeing one of the triplets seated alone in the forest, gently turning the pages of a book she knew had no pictures. She described him not with malice but with confusion. He looked not 6 years old but ancient in stillness, the way he waited, as if time were his to command. I backed away before he saw me, or perhaps he already had. An unmarried trader named Jonah Bledsoe, who passed through the area monthly, recounted that for nearly a year he had never once seen the triplets move. He insisted that each time he passed, one would be standing at the same corner of the mission fence, arms by his side, unblinking. I thought they were wooden cutouts the first 5 times. Then one day I blinked and he was gone. Just gone. There were other signs buried deeper in the fabric of the settlement. When Reverend Blackthorne began baptizing children in the river, mothers noticed their sons came back quieter, prone to long hours of staring and compulsive hand-washing. A traveling apothecary named Whitcomb recorded in his ledger that 3 boys, not the triplets, but local settler children, had developed the exact same fever at the same hour on the same night. Without contact, he attempted to treat them, but they would not respond to light or voice, only to touch. He never returned to the settlement. Blackthorne's last parish log was recovered alongside his burned chapel. It had no formal entries, only repetitions of the same phrase, "They have made their home in me." The line was repeated over 100 times, growing more erratic and less legible until the ink became unreadable smears. Near the final page, however, one clear sentence broke the pattern. "They are not evil. They are purpose, but I am too small for it." It was around this time that the remaining settlers began to leave the area entirely. A family named the Dornells abandoned their livestock and traveled northeast without explanation. A widower named Reuben Lyles, who had once advocated for Blackthorne's sainthood, was found in his field, teeth shattered from clenching, lips torn open, having carved "I am watched" into the bark of 4 separate trees. Only one letter of protest was ever officially submitted to the church regarding the mission. It came from a young novice, Sister Mary Claudine, who had served briefly at St. Amos before being called back to Baton Rouge. In it, she begged the diocese to intervene. Her words were careful yet desperate. "The boys are not cruel, but they are not innocent. They never make noise, not even when they fall. I once saw one walk into a thorn bush. He emerged without a single mark. I do not believe they sleep. And the Father, he speaks only in metaphor now and always in threes." Her letter was never answered. Her name appears once more in the record, attached to a ship manifest headed for Spain. She never reached her destination. A note by the registrar states, "Disembarked prematurely, claimed illness, did not reboard." Meanwhile, word of the triplets, or, more accurately, of 3 silent children who left no trace, began to surface in areas far from the Natchez Trace. In a report from 1786, a missionary stationed in the territory now known as Arkansas described encountering 3 boys of identical bearing, barefoot, carrying nothing, who requested no aid, yet remained present for 3 full days without rest. He believed them to be lost orphans at first, until he observed them watching him through the thin walls of his tent, unmoving for hours. His superiors dismissed the account as frontier fatigue. But the timing, location, and description were impossible to ignore. No bodies were ever recovered from the ruins of St. Amos, no graves, no bones. The Choctaw laborers who helped build the chapel vanished from oral record. Locals say their names are not remembered because they refused to speak them aloud after working there. Some say they left carvings in the trees, spiral motifs and circular marks now swallowed by time and forest. But even those who scoffed at such tales noticed a simple truth. No new mission was ever built on that land again. The area around the old mission grew quiet. Too quiet. No birds, no insects. Hunters said their dogs refused to enter the grove. Some swore they could hear the sound of whispering just at the edge of hearing, but never a voice, only the pressure, only the hush. And those who tried to settle the land, to plant, to farm, to build, never lasted more than a season. They always left with more questions than answers, and more silence than they arrived with. Those who remained in the region began to adopt a strange superstition. If you saw 3 children together in the woods, you did not call to them. You did not offer aid. You simply walked away and never spoke of it again. But in 1804, 2 decades after the mission vanished, a new group of Jesuits passing through the Mississippi Territory recorded a brief journal entry after camping near the ruins. It read, "We heard the sound of water, though no river runs near. 3 shadows stood at the edge of our campfire watching. No movement, no threat, but a pressure like the weight of years. We left before sunrise. The ground was cold." Horror uncovered. The story might have remained local folklore, a whisper passed among fur traders and fading settlers, were it not for the unlikely obsession of Dr. Nathaniel Meeks, a Philadelphia physician and amateur antiquarian, who in 1831 came into possession of Father Blackthorne's surviving ciphered journal. Meeks had no formal ties to the church, but a former theology student disgraced and excommunicated sold him the volume along with a bundle of colonial maps and tobacco coupons. Meeks, an early advocate of comparative ethnography, had spent years cataloguing the intersection of belief, behavior, and biology. He saw in Blackthorne's scrawled marks not madness, but a language. What followed was 10 years of study, replication, and eventual obsession. Meeks published only 1 paper before vanishing. In it he made no definitive claims, only observations, that the journal contained repeated symbols associated with natural cycles, flood patterns, lunar alignments, the migration habits of river fish. He noted that the number 3 recurred beyond coincidence, embedded not only in language but in spatial references. 3 steps from the altar to the entryway, 3 windows carved into the rear of the chapel, 3 triangular garden beds dug into the mission grounds. In 1842, Meeks traveled south under a pseudonym and lived briefly near the remains of St. Amos. His letters from this time, later published posthumously, became the foundation of what historians now refer to as the Triplet Observations. In them, Meeks detailed strange phenomena that began almost immediately upon his arrival. The sounds of knocking, always 3 on trees around his camp at night, a recurring sense of being watched from just beyond the firelight, and an inexplicable compulsion to hum a tune he did not recognize. But it was a surveyor's sketchbook, found decades later in a Mississippi archive, that revealed the most unsettling evidence. Drawn in 1853 by a team mapping mineral-rich zones near the old mission site, one sketch shows a clearing with 3 worn stone pillars and, at its center, a pit lined with bones. Human bones, small ones, neatly arranged. When the surveyors returned a week later with officials, the site had been filled in, the stones scattered, and the pit gone. No one could explain it. The incident was never reported to newspapers. The bones weren't the only things hidden. A cabin deeper in the forest, once used by trappers, was found with its interior walls scratched from floor to ceiling with markings matching those in Blackthorne's cipher. The cabin belonged to a man named Erasmus Key, who had taken up residence in 1829 and was last seen in 1835. Locals said he spoke often of boys without shadows and refused to sleep indoors after sundown. When his cabin was opened, they found no bedding, no food, just a single locked trunk containing the following items: 3 wooden dolls, each with blank faces, and a page torn from a hymnal with the words LETTHEMSTAYQUIET written over the music staff. At the national level, none of this was acknowledged. But quietly, within certain circles of the church and early psychological science, the case of the silent triplets became a point of hushed study. Letters between Jesuit colleges reference the Amos pattern, a term never explained in full, but always discussed in threes. One cryptic passage in an 1871 Vatican communique reads, "Avoid Trinity manifestations beyond sanctioned doctrine. Refer to Amos if unknown variables arise." Even by the standards of 19th century superstition, these documents bore a strange uniformity. The triplets, wherever referenced, were never described aging. From Blackthorne's original sketches to Meeks's field notes, their appearance remained unchanged, 6 or 7 years old, identical height, identical eyes, expressionless. No scars, no marks of injury or growth. A perfect replication, a static anomaly. The few who attempted to rationalize this pattern proposed theories as varied as frontier mass hysteria, psychological projection, and deliberate clerical deception. But one theory, found buried in the archives of the Louisiana Historical Society, dared to go further. It proposed that the triplets were not children at all, not in the biological sense, but phenomena of behavior without origin, a phrase repeated multiple times in the notes of Dr. Alphonse Verdier, an early neurologist known for his work on fugue states and collective amnesia. Verdier believed the children represented an intrusion, not supernatural, not divine, but behavioral, a presence that invoked silence not just through fear, but through absorption. Those who encountered the triplets began to mirror them. Long silences, repetitive behavior, sudden withdrawals from society. He called it behavioral contagion with no infection vector. In other words, the children changed people by proximity alone. His most damning claim was this, that the church had known, that Blackthorn's mission was not to bring Christ to the wilderness, but to contain something that had been found there, that the boys, whether created, found, or summoned, had served as vessels for a kind of silence not meant to be broken. His work was suppressed, of course, his license revoked after a failed public demonstration in which he presented 3 child actors dressed as the triplets, attempting to induce silence in a volunteer crowd. The event ended in laughter, then chaos, as 2 attendees collapsed in seizures and one began clawing at his own ears, screaming about a humming sound no one else could hear. Verdier died in obscurity, but his notes survived. And among them was a chilling transcription of a local tale from the Natchez region, of a woman who during the flood season of 1799 found 3 boys standing knee-deep in water at the edge of her property. She claimed they smiled, but only with their eyes, and one handed her a stone. When asked what they wanted, they replied not with words, but by turning and walking slowly into the water. She never saw them again. Her child, a daughter born the following spring, was mute for her first 9 years of life. When she finally spoke, her first words were, "They are not gone." Historians dismiss these connections as folklore, too wide in geography, too vague in evidence, but the records remain official and unofficial, and in every retelling, no matter how distant or distorted, the same details repeat. 3 boys, identical, silent. Present only at the edge of perception. They do not cry, they do not age, they do not leave until the silence sets in. Even now, travelers near the old Natchez Trace report strange sensations, the pressing stillness, the sudden hush of the woods, the sense of being observed without malice but with patience, always patience, legacy and silence. By the start of the 20th century, Mississippi had transformed. Railroads replaced old trails. The deep woods where St. Amos once stood were slowly cleared for farmland and logging. New towns were mapped, schools built, churches re-established, and yet something in the land refused to settle. Families who built near the remains of the mission rarely lasted more than a few years. Not for lack of resources or safety, but because of something they couldn't quite explain. Their dogs barked at trees, children sleepwalked. Windows fogged from the inside in patterns shaped like open hands. A 1907 geological survey team inadvertently reignited interest in the area when they published a photo showing 3 identical depressions in a grassy field near the old mission grounds. They had meant to document soil erosion, but were bombarded with letters from amateur historians who recognized the pattern, the same triangular formation described by Meeks, the surveyors of 1853, and even Blackthorn himself. When the team returned to photograph the site a second time, the depressions were gone. No prints, no signs of tampering. The grass had grown in smooth and unbroken, but it wasn't just in Mississippi that the pattern persisted. In 1914, a schoolteacher in rural Kentucky, Miss Adelaide Vance, was dismissed after repeatedly assigning students to draw the quiet boys from a dream she claimed they'd all shared. Sketches from her class, preserved in a museum collection in Lexington, show three identical figures standing side by side, eyes wide, mouths closed, with the faint outline of a building behind them that strongly resembles St. Amos's documented floor plan. Varnes was later institutionalized for suggestive hysteria after whispering to a nurse during intake, "They never stopped watching me, I just stopped reacting." The pattern never screamed. It never killed outright, it hollowed instead. Entire family lines from the region quietly thinned. Deaths were not violent but strange. A child who simply stopped eating, a hunter who forgot how to return home, a woman who walked into a river and did not struggle. These were not horrors that drew headlines, they were statistical noise, ripples mistaken for coincidence, but always there. In the 1950s, the first and only archaeological dig, permitted near the St. Amos grounds, was conducted under the pretense of studying colonial architecture. Led by Dr. Helen Kressner, the team lasted 11 days. On the 12th, they abandoned the site. No formal report was issued. Kressner herself vanished from public life. But a graduate student involved in the dig later released a private account to a fringe academic journal. In it, he described finding 3 hand-dug wells, each precisely 6 feet deep, lined with cedar wood that showed no signs of rot. At the bottom of each, a flat stone, worn smooth, with no markings, and at the rim of each well, 3 fingernail scratches. He wrote, "We did not feel watched. We felt expected." The church's involvement has never been clarified. While the Diocese of Baltimore refuses to release its 18th century correspondence regarding Father Blackthorne, a leak in 1973 revealed that the Vatican maintains a sealed file labeled Trinitas Silens Mississippi, last accessed in 1949. The contents remain unknown, but among the leaked notes was a margin comment written in Latin, nothing heretical, but something irreversible. Even local maps acknowledge the silence. The exact location of the former mission has never been marked on any official registry. Instead, the land is labeled disused tract or undeveloped plot. In 1987, a proposal to build a rest area along a newly expanded route near the area was abruptly cancelled after construction workers walked off the job, citing unease and confusion. One foreman reported seeing 3 boys, shirtless, standing in the fog behind a tree line. His colleagues saw nothing. He never worked again. A handful of cultural anthropologists have tried to reclaim the story, framing it as a metaphor, a colonial allegory for lost innocence, or the dangers of religious imposition on indigenous land. But none have been able to explain why the sightings, why even in recent years travelers post online about children seen along back roads near Natchez, always at dusk, never moving, never speaking. In 2002, a documentary team attempted to retrace Father Blackthorne's journey and film at the old site. The footage was never completed. The director, in a rare interview, said only, "The sound guy left the mic open the whole time. There was nothing on the tape, no birds, no wind, no voices, just tape hiss. 72 hours of tape hiss. And still the story lingers." Not in textbooks or town records, but in glances. In old songs children hum without learning. In dreams where people wake up clutching stones they don't remember picking up. In places where the woods go quiet all at once. There is no cemetery for the boys, no death records, no photographs beyond Blackthorne's sketches, but their presence is not tethered to physical form. It is stitched into the behavior of a place, into the rhythm of its absences. The horror of the silent triplets lies not in what they did, but in what they left behind, a perfectly preserved absence that continues to replicate itself through time, undetected, unnamed, and impossible to disprove. Because silence, when curated with enough devotion, is the most enduring structure of all. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way we can see how far these stories are reaching. And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering.